Welcome back, pet parent. I have another incredible brand to talk to this week, and I'm so excited. Been trying to set this up for so long. Y'all know how picky I am about the brands I like, about the foods I like to feed, about the foods I recommend. There really aren't that many, and I'm just so excited. Thank you, Nicole, for being here today to represent Small Batch, which
Absolutely.
is one of the foods that I keep in rotation for my animals. And I'm so excited to finally have you here. So welcome.
Thank you. We appreciate the invitation and the opportunity, and I know a long time coming.
Yeah, yeah. So I would like to just start out by, I think one of the things and the reason that I reached out to you guys initially is because we have some really incredible, smaller, newer brands in the market, but there are still a couple that have you've been there for a little while. I think sometimes we can get caught up in the shiny new things, and we can sometimes forget about the like old trusty things that are still doing great. And that was
Mm-hmm.
like one of the reasons why I reached out to you in the first place, is because I'm like, but you guys have a really great product that I really like, and I don't want people to forget about it. Like, I'm sure you guys are doing great. I don't mean people are forgetting about you, but like it's important to remind people that, like, yeah, there are these incredible newer companies that are out there, but one, we always want to keep a rotation of foods going. That's not just for me, it's not just with like proteins, but it's also with brands, because you just never know. Like, as a
Definitely.
pet parent, you have to diversify, right? You just never know what's going to happen. And I'm so glad that you guys, even for like the amount of time you've been around,
Yeah.
like you're still doing it, you're still making food in a way that somebody like me can say, no, I actually really like this brand, even though they've been around a while.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely been an interesting path in small batch compared to the way that the category has been illuminated, really in the last kind of 5 to 6 years. And one of the most amazing parts of the small batch timeline is the fact that 2025 is actually our 20th anniversary from, the concepting, there we go, of, a pet food. I have felt like the trajectory of slow and steady and really focus is actually a thing that sets us apart from the majority of the brands that you'll find on freezer shelves right now. From the get-go, the focus was on the quality of ingredients and harnessing the raw materials and their nutritional integrity to craft a really beautiful product. The Vogel family was living in Bay Area, San Francisco around 2005, and if you're familiar with that area, the culinary scene is fantastic. There is myriad of super, super premium materials for livestock and produce between Northern California, Central Valley, Southern Oregon. And so the idea of the slow food movement was kind of present in the community at that time. And a lot of the restaurateurs were really into the concept of taking fresh food and getting it into people's meals, onto their plates, in through the restaurant doors or local grocers as quickly as possible. And so that real culinary artistic attitude and reverence for sourcing was the onus for the brand. And it was a really a thoughtful philosophy that required really gradual progression. And so I think we've seen in the last, decade a lot of marketing money that you can kind of put a facade on a brand. And small batch has been sort of chugging along, slow and steady, doing what we do, truly with a really small team of people for a very long time, and has not wavered from those commitments to do right ultimately by our consumers, which are pet parents and the animals in their care, by, not cutting corners. And to do that, you can't grow rapidly. You can't, change your philosophies or deviate from those methodologies and still have the same product at the end of the day.
That is so true. It was actually something Susan Thixton said to me a number of years ago. She said that just because it's in the freezer doesn't mean it's good.
Absolutely.
And I wasn't like I didn't know that, but to hear it, like, I don't know, it was something about her saying that to me. I was like, wow, like that is not something that we talk very much about in this community, because I think one of the like just trying to get people over
Hmm.
from the, kibble aisle. It's like, just come on, anything in the freezer. Just get over here,
Yeah.
anything in the freezer, right? And
Yeah.
that's really not, I mean, yes, probably anything in the freezer may be better than a kibble diet, but they're definitely not all created equal. And as you said, like there are some indie pet stores that I walk in that I'm like, okay, this is an interesting selection that you have here. And then there are other indie pet stores that I walk in and I'm like, this is amazing. I love your freezer. And there is a difference. And I'm obviously not trying to like call anybody out here, but I'm very, very picky. I know I'm very, very picky, and I'm just really excited to have you on to talk a little bit more about small batch. So it sounds like started from the whole like foodie movement, which is still a thing. And what you've kind of described is really how you have set yourselves apart from other brands. It's like this is our philosophy. This is the end product that we want to provide. We want it to be really high quality, and it sounds to me like it's you would rather make sure that that end product meets your requirements versus any growth that maybe happen. Like you would
Yeah.
rather pass up growth that would require you to do something you're not comfortable doing. And
Yeah.
I like that. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And to kind of expand from just the end product, that may be the piece that we have in retail stores on shelves that consumers then are going to put in bowls at home. But looking the opposite direction in the production sense, it's crucial that we are contributing positively as consumers of the food landscape in our country, because available food materials, whether it be meat or produce, those suppliers are responding to consumer demand. And one of my favorite things that David Vogel, one of our founders, told me when I was brand new with the team, the meat that small batch sources, those animals should have one bad day. And if we are making sure that the livestock we procure has lived with respectful treatment, species appropriate conditions, so that they are not only healthy and raised to be, as nutritionally sound and viable as possible, but sort of our energetic contribution to food shed, has a really positive impact. Because like we said, we want from start to finish small batch to be making a net positive impact on wellness for all creatures. And it's an interesting consideration to sort of look at the options for meat sourcing, whether it be domestic or international, and sort of where factory farming or confinement style agriculture fits into that picture. And there are some staggering statistics about how much of factory farmed meats is consumed directly by the pet industry. And so we focus so pointedly on our companion animals and we forget that we may be directly supporting the negative life experience of an animal that's being consumed or raised for consumption, you know?
Well, I think that's important because I was certainly wanting to talk to you about sourcing today because it is something that, one, yes, as you just said, being conscious consumers is important. And I personally, I do try with as much as I can to feed my pets in a way that I do know
Hmm.
where whatever company I'm purchasing the food from, where they're getting the ingredients from, where that I feel comfortable with that. And I try to do the same for me, where I am buying meats from preferably like regenerative farms and things like that. Similarly with produce, having organic produce whenever possible. I think, one, I always say this, that it to me is a privilege to be able to have these conversations and to be able to purchase these types of foods, to understand that, one, understand that this is something we need to be paying attention to, but then also to be able to source them and purchase them. And what small batch does, in my opinion, it like kind of takes the guesswork out of it for pet
Yes.
parents. And another thing that I wanted to bring up, I've been talking a lot in my live videos recently about greenwashing in the pet industry. And I feel like, one of the first things when I see the name small batch, I'm like, okay, I'm glad I know that this is actually a really good food, because that would be something that, like, if it were anybody else, I would have red flags of like, okay, what is this marketing that you are selling
Yeah.
to me?
Isn't it funny now how everybody in every category, whether it be hard goods or treats or foods now, and we have been small batch literally because that is how the food is produced, like I said, for 20 years now. It's not it's not anything that's been curated with that marketing spin. It is a genuine reflection of the way that the food started. It was David and Diana making a small batch in their kitchen for, people that were getting food from them locally.
That's incredible. Okay, so I do want to go back a little bit. You've said so much already about the sourcing of the food itself, the ingredients that go into the food. Okay, we are very aware of how the animals are raised, the animals are slaughtered. Are we To me, I also think that that makes the food more nutritious
Absolutely.
and energetically, which is a whole thing that we don't have to go down. But for me, like, the energy of that food is also very different when you know that that animal lived a good life. So are we sourcing primarily in the United States? Are we like, can you just go maybe a little bit more into and with the produce as well? Because I know it's organic
Yeah.
produce.
Yes. To to call out produce first, 100% of what small batch sources meets the standards that we're going to talk about. And that unto itself sort of fits in that bucket where we started of what makes small batch different. And fortunately or unfortunately, marketing and AFCO and what is permissible as far as claims on packaging, they don't let us say directly 100% of what we do meets these standards. And that's really where, particularly brands in the freezer, have the opportunity to cut corners. It might be 60% of what we do, and the other 40% is of a different caliber, and everything in between the possible span of combinations. But so as far as produce and herbs that we procure, 100% of everything is certified organic. It is all domestically procured almost exclusively from the West Coast. The one exception is the chia seeds, and it kind of fits with the same philosophy as the meat that we procure. There is always going to be a best place for some of these materials to be raised. So, where things should grow naturally to be their most robust, nutritious selves is a part of the equation. But meat that we procure, the philosophy has always been to buy as close to production as possible from small farms that we contract with directly. That's one of the first and most important pieces that is, again, a difference with small batch. A lot of production is done through co-manufacturers. Well, they will go out and actually procure according to whatever set of standards you set forward. But basically, you are putting it in the hands of a third party to do what you would do, to have the same, stringent evaluation of a potential source. So for us to contract directly with small farms that have demonstrated competency and commitment to the best of animal husbandry that we can find is piece one. Finding them as close to production is a component, and then the best quality that we can source to make sure that we can guarantee our production, and get things as fresh to the facility as possible is piece number two. It's, I don't think, discussed enough how fluid the meat industry can be. We've navigated a lot of changes in the last 5 years, particularly since COVID, but even small suppliers, they're acquired, they have new ownership. Practices may change, certifications may change. So it is kind of an ongoing process of adjustment. But as far as meat procurement, 90% of what we source is currently all domestic. The exceptions would be rabbit, which is coming from France. We had to move our domestic rabbit supplier, but the partner that we have actually produces for culinary use rabbit. And then we have been able to get secondary and tertiary sourcing for certain materials that we use a lot of. Beef is a great example. You don't want to pigeonhole yourself by having one supplier only, because then when something happens, what do? We've got one grass-fed beef supplier in New Zealand that has done a little bit for us that is an amazing. The quality of the meat and the balance of protein to fat is absolutely beautiful. So it is a little bit flexible, but domestic is our first priority to meet that quality and accessibility to our proximity to production standard.
Well, and I think that's a very good point because I'm like, well, is it US? Is it US? But
Yeah,
there are certainly cases where you can find better overseas.
absolutely. Yeah. We have become very tied to US being a standard, and that's not as cut and dry. There are beautiful resources all over the world. It's what's that particular supplier that you're looking at?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that I'm curious about, and I hope it's okay to bring this up. I can edit it if not. One of the things that I was talking with your team about at Super Zoo last year, well prior to Super Zoo, but I got to in person, was there was big to do about a year ago where some of the recipes formulation something changed, something in the supply chain changed, and the formulation needed to be redone very quickly with a couple of synthetic, I don't remember exactly what it was, some synthetic vitamins and minerals. It was very minimal, but I know that reformulation was like in the works.
Hmm.
And just to kind of keep the standard of transparency, that was a thing that happened. Are the new recipes out yet? Can you talk a little bit about how you do formulate your recipes? And, when something like this comes up, you just obviously want to make sure that pets are having access to the food that they're used to having as
Yes.
quickly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the nature of utilizing organic materials, and organic being, in their natural form, is the inherent variation. It's a thing that we embrace wholeheartedly as the best way to deliver, sound lifelong wellness to our pets. And then we also have to balance that with a commercial pet industry and AFCO feeding guidelines and nutrition panels where we've sort of trained consumers to be very stringent in thinking that a recipe will deliver exact nutrients and be uniform with every single feed. And that's actually not nature's design. You will never find two pieces of beef that have the exact same, amino acid inclusion or fat to protein ratio. You will never see two heads of cauliflower or bunches of celery that are identical in their makeup. And like we said, that's why animals naturally have variation. But what we were looking at last year was that ongoing process of raw material audits. We are continually balancing any new supplier that might come into the mix with the individual ingredient analysis for that nutritional profile and then reassessing the impact on the recipe as a whole. It's tricky for us as a brand to negotiate the necessity for that really consistent formulation and nutritional panel with the knowledge that a lot of our consumers don't rotate. They don't rotate between proteins available with small batch, or they're not rotating between small batch and other brands. And so to look at a single formula and say, this has to meet every single standard, every single batch, there are things that can shift that balance. So as part of kind of the full audit, we are always going back to the drawing board to look at, which components of this can we shift? Could we add a little bit of this? Could we use a different cut of meat to offset, something that may have changed as far as raw material supply or supplier, like I mentioned. So the decision was made in the freeze dried foods to add the glycinates, which they're not synthetic vitamins. They're actually just naturally occurring minerals that are bound to protein. So they are really easy to absorb. It's the most natural way to supplement anything with the least inclusion in a formula. And for the sake of our consumers, rather than risk, we'll put risk in quotes, rather than risk having a customer who's using one formula exclusively potentially see, a deficit in a single nutrient, we decided we're going to utilize this as kind of a plan for the interim and really evaluate what we can to get these back out of the diets and make sure that we have adjusted. We've always got new information too to consider and looking for new suppliers for things that we might want to utilize when we're shifting those recipes around. But the really exciting news is the new formulas across our categories are just starting to roll out. We have already touched our frozen raw cat diets and some really beautiful brand new packaging, which we're going to be debuting at the big global pet expo coming up in 2 weeks, is just starting to hit retail shelves. So in addition to the new styling, those recipe updates are going to be making their way into the landscape. The raw cat sliders will be the first that we see. And then those dog freeze dried sliders is going to be the next category. And then we did a little bit of an overhaul on our frozen lightly cooked sliders for dogs as well. So it's really been, dare I say, a labor of love and an incredible amount of work. But, the effort to get it right and ensure that nutritional viability and the recipe integrity is, you know, it's not something that you can do quickly, for sure. And we want to maintain a really palatable recipe without disrupting, what pets have become accustomed to. Because we certainly have a large percentage of the small batch customer base that has found our products for a really particular set of reasons, be it ingredient sensitivities or, just a picky pet but really likes the flavor of the formula. So there's tons of considerations, but my goodness, it's been, uh, you know, long time coming, and we are excited to see these new formulas rolling out.
Yeah, I'm glad when you started that you brought up the fact that it is difficult. It can be very difficult to reconcile the fact that when we are feeding whole, fresh foods, like no animal in the wild lives off of, eating off of a spreadsheet, but just inherently being a commercially available pet food, you have these rules and regulations and guidelines that you have to stick to be quote complete and balanced based on the AFCO guidelines that the FDA has adopted. And it's really it is something that I talk a lot about with different brands, because the brands that I have on, like yourself, it is something that you really wrestle with all the time, knowing that at least if we can get there without adding in all these extra vitamins and minerals, heaven forbid a premix, right? Um, if we can get there with all whole fresh foods, that's, even though some people would argue that feeding every single meal, every single bite, 100% complete and balanced may not actually be the best thing for our dogs and our cats. At least if we're doing it with all fresh whole foods and we're not adding in synthetics at all, then I think their bodies can kind of take what it needs and get rid of the rest a whole heck of a lot easier than if we are doing it with synthetics.
Yeah, absolutely. That utilization, the consumption, utilization, and elimination is all, things that we have to consider when we're feeding our pets. And we've always looked at it as a nature's inherent design is the best way. If we are really using 100% whole food materials, we've got that variance built in. Now we have to come up with the formula that sort of does touch those necessary spreadsheet boxes and, you know, then deliver the nutrients in that most usable, viable form possible.
Yeah. Well, and I think I categorize the idea that every single bite needs to be complete and balanced to AFCO standards as a huge misconception.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any other misconceptions that just Small Batch as a brand likes to kind of dispel for people in the pet food arena?
Ooh, likes to dispel. I do think that some of the human food philosophies, as far as uh, diet approaches that have been adopted by the pet industry, have been really interesting to look at. In some regards, there's some interesting kind of over sciencing and idealization of what we want to deliver with every single bite, like you said. I don't know that we could ever impose one standard or metric of measure that we could call most ideal for every single pet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely it's reflected in the small batch products with the variety of forms that we have come up with and the variety of pets that we feed and other industry myths. That's a good one.
It's okay. I threw
I
that
think
one at you.
yeah, I mean, we could talk about whole cuts of meat. That's not exactly a myth, but since we did touch upon it a little bit earlier, the sort of greenwashing and assumption that because food is in the freezer, it's good. We've used sort of jokingly the description that raw food has been kibblized, and what was once a much narrower segment has become the focus of a ton of bigger brands that want sort of a piece of the fresh food movement. So it's easy to pay a formulator and use a lot of money to get a food produced, and every single ingredient and then the summation of the recipe as a whole can be very bottom of the barrel, least expensive possible, all the way up to super premium, thoughtfully sourced for the nutritional value, um, and anywhere in between. And there are a lot of claims of caliber and quality that do read really well on bags, but when you start to dig below the surface, meat in particular, there is a whole variety of forms or pieces of meat to actually procure. And it's incredibly unique that small batch uses exclusively whole cuts of meat. We don't use any, zero, pre-processed or rendered trims or mechanically separated meat. Mechanically separated meat is becoming a little bit more of a, you know, common term in premium pet food, but to do this short summary or definition of it, it is essentially the rendered leftovers after the good cuts of meat have been removed from a carcass to be sold generally for human consumption in high-end restaurant and grocery. So what is left after that processing is some amount of meat, but it is largely skin, fat, and frame or bone. Those carcasses, dozens and dozens and dozens, all get ground down in a machine, and then anything that can be liquefied is sort of forced through this big sieve in a centrifuge. So if you think back to years ago when McDonald's pink slime entered people's awareness, that's mechanically separated meat. And the real interesting realization was people discovered, oh, wait, there's no chicken in your chicken nuggets. So if we're using that as a component in what is supposed to be a biologically appropriate way to feed our animals, we have to start to wonder how much usable protein is actually left in that material. Same goes for trims. There are a whole variety of calibers and qualities of trims. It's a much easier way to procure meat, and it is also a less expensive material to use. You'll generally have a lot more fat in those two forms, and so it's an easy way to hit your caloric need. It's definitely prevalent in raw food. And it's not something that you have to call out on an ingredient label because ACO definitions have a lengthy description for what you are allowed to call out as chicken or beef. So it's a way for manufacturers to buffer their supply because it's easy to procure, so you don't have to worry about running out. It's also much, much less, pennies on the dollar in certain cases to procure those materials. So it gives you a nice margin, but it also helps stretch whatever higher caliber or quality materials you are using so that, the amount of food that you are able to produce goes further. But that's maybe not so much of a myth as a, raw food secret.
Yeah, yeah.
And the length that small batch has gone to never ever in any of our 20 years use those materials is, I think, something that doesn't get communicated enough because it's hard to teach people all of the background of what raw material procurement can look like.
Yeah, well, I think so many people are just completely unaware
Mhm.
of, first of all, what AFCO is actually there for, what the big pet food is actually there for. And so they don't understand that chicken, what they think of as chicken when they go to the grocery store, isn't what the definition of chicken is in pet
Right,
food. Like they just are
exactly.
feed. They don't, and it's so complicated and it's so, I mean, you as a consumer, you don't even have access to those definitions unless you purchase them. Like it is the most insane thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Insane thing to me, but
And even if you do, then you're reading it as words on a piece of paper.
yeah.
It's not a visual in front of you to
Mhm.
give you that sort of pictographic
Yeah.
dictionary of what does that mean? What are all the possibilities? And I know that the consumer belief that, well, raw food wouldn't use that. All raw food has to be decent.
Yeah, that's
Um,
not at all. No, that's not the case at all. In fact, I mean, there are definitely. I actually just looked up another raw food company in Australia recently because Colgate Palmolive bought them, which is Hills. And I looked them up online and I'm like, what is this? Who is this? And it's like something I would never in my wildest dreams feed to my animal, but it's still a raw food in a log that you buy in the freezer. And I'm very interested. As you said, these big players are starting to like see the writing on the wall and that, consumers want better for their pets. And so they are dipping their toes in and buying up, some of these companies. To me, like this one particular company that was just purchased in Australia was like a frozen version of kibble.
mm,
But I mean, when I'm looking at the ingredient label, I'm like, yeah, no. But it is very interesting to see, and I'm sure you guys have seen in the 20 years. And I think I don't remember how late you've been there a good chunk of those years.
yeah,
This change and this trajectory in the pet food industry overall, which I think is a good thing. I was even talking to somebody yesterday and I was like, as much as I don't like the farmer's dog, for example, I don't like their recipes, I am very grateful for their marketing budget because they have raised awareness to so many people that you don't have to feed that dry junk that's sitting in your pantry to your pet every meal for the rest of their life. And I'm like, as much as I don't like their formulation, I am very grateful that they have I don't have many millions to put a Super Bowl at.
yeah. Isn't that wild? How many thousands of dollars for each second does that cost? But we will gratefully say the same because we have had these players not just in fresh food, there were a few in kibble that actually reached consumers with that messaging. You need to be looking at what goes into the food that you're buying. And it may start with reading it off of the packaging, ingredient by ingredient, and then it elevates from there as awareness is established and pursuit of more understanding, sort of sets in. And that's fantastic. We have to spend all of our pennies on the raw materials, the production, and distribution out to our, retail partners that we can. No Super Bowl money yet, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I just have a couple more questions for you. One is, first of all, I'm actually kind of surprised that you said there's new packaging rolling out because I feel like you
Yeah.
guys just rolled out new packaging in the past couple of years, which was beautiful.
We started to update. You probably are thinking of our Super Booster Bite.
Maybe.
So those are a treat or topper option, and those were the very first products that sort of gave nod to the new styling. The diets, the frozen raw cat, the dog raw formulas, those have actually not been touched in more than a decade. So this is a big deal for us to redo the look of small batch. But the reception to it so far has been really, really positive. And small batch has such a distinct look on shelf. And I know it's a big deal when anything changes. And I am really confident that our retailers and customers are going to have, a really big positive reactions to the new look.
Yeah. Well, I do want to touch on the fact that you do have more than just the food. So if you want to talk a little bit about like the whole line that you
Sure.
do offer, I'd love to
Yeah,
give you that opportunity.
absolutely. The evolution from a great raw food has sort of been a reflection of what the small batch loyalists have requested. And that feeding philosophy that some fresh food is vastly better than none has always been really near and dear to our hearts because you mentioned we've got a whole variety of influences, be it accessibility to independent retail, budget, pet needs, maybe medical conditions. There are drivers for people in what they choose, what they're able to feed, what they choose to feed, what works best for their routine in their household. And so sort of being able to broaden the variety of choices has been amazing and certainly a way for us to get more options into the landscape. So we have those complete and balanced diets that are in a few formats in the freezer. We do the raw diets, both for dogs and cats. And I always love to mention our cat diets for a raw food are one of the best starter raw recipes available. The first food that we made was actually for Blue the cat, who people have seen recently on our Instagram. But we sell more chicken cat fighters than, my gosh, almost any other SKU that we produce, which is kind of wild. But we do those complete and balanced raw diets. In the freezers, you will also find the lightly cooked recipes for dogs. That was sort of an adaptation because we had more and more of our consumer base that was looking to do a home prepared diet. And a lot of them were finding that for a variety of reasons, either their veterinary partners had some resistance to raw, or they had maybe an animal or human in their home that had immune issues, and they felt like doing something that was very gently cooked was a safer point of entry. So those diets for us are sous vide. They are fully cooked, so the temperature still comes up to 165 degrees for pasteurization of pathogens per FDA safety regulations. But what we found with those is the proteins themselves are a bit more digestible for animals whose digestive tracts just aren't as robust. And that could be for a whole variety of reasons, be it age, they're brand new to fresh food for the first time in their lives, a medical issue, like we mentioned. That is a really fast growing category for us. And we're super excited. We're going to be expanding the proteins in those lightly cooked sliders, announcing them at Global. So we will have two brand new recipes to share with our consumers soon, which we are thrilled about. Um, Outside of the freezers, we have the complete and balanced diet available in freeze dried formats. So that's going to be freeze dried sliders for dogs. And those recipes are almost identical to their frozen raw counterpart, but made in the shelf stable format so that you can rehydrate, keep them in your emergency kit, perfect for all of the travel, dog sitter, versatility, backup plan needs that you might come up with. And we have the complete and balanced freeze dried meal bites for cats as well. Those are such a cool mix in for people that might do some raw for their cats, some canned food for their cats. They're a 98% meat, bone, organ recipe. My dogs actually love them as treat bites. So I use them as a giant bag of, mix-ins and addition to my training pouch when we go on our walks. And then we have a variety of small batch treat options. The super boosters that we mentioned before, we created them really to be a check all the boxes, super high value treat or meal topper recipe. We have 95% meat, bone, organ in all of those varieties. Each protein is then paired with a specific superfood. So we get to have a little bit of variety in that functional benefit. And then those are also augmented with a fermented probiotic. So the pairings for those across the recipes are chicken with turmeric, beef with papaya, turkey with cranberry, duck with lion's mane mushroom, which happens to be one of my favorites, lamb with blackberry, pork with chamomile and blueberry, which is probably my second most favorite, and then a rabbit bite that's paired with dandelion greens.
Mm.
So you kind of get that ideal super meat centric, minimal ingredient recipe, but with those superfoods that might be used to leverage specific wellness needs and offer that little bit of digestive support. And, versatile. Use them how you need, as your treat, as your bowl mix in, and they are appropriate for dogs and cats. That's, I feel like, overlooked thing with a lot of the small batch products. There's a lot of versatility in what we have created. In a single ingredient freeze dried treat lane, we have had our freeze dried hearts for a while. Those are available in chicken, turkey, beef, lamb, and pork. All of the larger proteins are chopped up into pieces and the chicken hearts are whole. And then earlier this year, we added freeze-dried livers to the lineup. So hearts and livers being two of the most nutrient-dense organs in the body that you can feed. And maybe for people that aren't using a fresh food diet exclusively, or they want to add that really nutrient-rich organ meat as just their treat portion of their feed routine. The freeze dried livers are that one single ingredient chopped up and freeze dried. I will point out an interesting thing with some single ingredient treats is that you can still actually use rendered materials and then repress and form them into pieces that sort of look like they were once just whole cuts of meat. Um, but small batch livers are never pre-processed. There's no preservative agents. They are clean and simple. And those are available in beef, chicken, duck, which is kind of a neat one,
Mm-hmm.
lamb, and pork. And then, my goodness, I know, it goes on. We have the bone broths. We do a simple frozen 3 ingredient broth that's kind of what we call the small batch purist recipe. It is bones, water, and carrot. So unique that we don't use any apple cider vinegar in that recipe. It's just slow simmered, so that we get absorption or breakdown of that really good mineral, collagen, glucosamine into the broth itself. But it's a choice option for picky pets that don't like the flavor or the smell of that vinegar, or pets that may have a condition that would put them in the histamine intolerant category. So nice that we've got, you know, that option for that crowd. Doesn't get talked about a lot, histamines. But the other option for the bone broths is our shelf stable broths. We've called it a restorative recipe, and each of those has a functional herb that's kind of an adaptogenic inspired recipe and prebiotic fiber. The shelf stable broths are available in chicken, beef, venison, and pork, and they're unique for a myriad of reasons. One, we do not use a typical shelf stabilization process on them. Majority of the food landscape will use what's called retort, which is a high heat exposure, sort of flash treatment to mitigate pathogen presence to make it shelf stable, or irradiation. Those are the two fastest, most commonly accessed methods. Our broth is actually made shelf stable with a pH neutralization process. So we leverage that apple cider vinegar that is in these broths and lemon to make it a pH neutral environment that prevents pathogen growth. So we don't alter the ingredients themselves with any of those sterilization processes. And we keep the efficacy of the functional pairings sound, because it's great if you put ashwagandha in a recipe, but if it has been so heavily heat treated or processed, it's not viable by the time you're consuming it or your pet is consuming it, then we've sort of lost the original intent. But the pairings are a beef with lavender, the chicken with clove, the venison has, geez, I have to check,
Yep. Australia.
and then pork with mushroom.
Oh, nice.
And the pork recipes and venison broth are two of my most favorites. Venison is only found in the shelf stable broth for the small batch products as of right now. And the bones themselves actually come from the Maui Nui venison program, which I love in sort of the holistic community. Maui Nui program has gotten a little bit of spotlight recently, but
Yeah.
it's It's a program that really gives reverence to the island ecosystem to control the population of axis deer that live there so that they, you know, keep the population in check, but they are then utilizing the whole animal once those animals are processed. And in the treat space, new and coming soon, we are going to be showing some really exciting single ingredient freeze dried fish treats. Small Batch has not ventured into fish until this point, and reasons being finding suppliers that meet small batch standards is an even trickier undertaking when it comes with fisheries. There is a lot less visibility when you take things offshore than when you've got an operation on land that you can manage, you know, with real consistency. So we are going to be adding some freeze-dried pollock, some freeze-dried rainbow trout, and some freeze-dried blue mussels to the options in the treat space, which
Oh,
we are thrilled about. And those are also all labeled for dogs or cats. So something for everybody.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this actually will not air until after Global, so I'm excited for all the new stuff and the new recipes and just for everything you guys are doing and being like transparent about your sourcing. I think that's one of the biggest things for me when I am recommending pet foods is like I can't figure out if I don't know if you're not being open and honest about where you're getting everything from. Like I just don't know how. But that's me. That's just me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I appreciate it and I appreciate what you guys are doing. I look forward. I will not be at Global, but I plan on being at Super Zoo, so hopefully I'll see you
Great.
there.
Yeah.
And yeah, is there anything else that you've touched on so many things
I
that like I didn't
know.
even have to ask questions about?
This is a great conversation, and the opportunity to really talk to our customer base and give them new things to think about when it comes to picking a raw food, picking treats, aligning themselves with a company. I'm always hopeful that we can give a little bit of, fuel to the fire, so to speak. Not only reiterate that small batch standards, I think, are of a caliber unto themselves, but the products that we've produced for 20 years have continued to hit that mark, and we're excited to see what comes.
I am too. So thank you so much for being here and for helping, just continuing to educate pet parents about, it as I just said, like it's not just look at the ingredient label. That's a really great place to start that we should all be doing. But we unfortunately have to go beyond the ingredient label and say, okay, but where is this coming from? And like you said, whole cuts of meat. There's so many intricacies that we don't talk about enough.
Mhm.
And again, part of that I do think is it's a privilege to be able to have these conversations, to be able to think far
Certainly.
enough out that's just not how am I going to feed my pet today? Like I get, we're privileged to have these conversations, but they still are conversations that I think are important and need to be had. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a
All right.
privilege for us to get to nourish so many pet bowls. And we encourage, I think one message to take away is reach out to your brand and ask them the questions directly. That is a real, real good way to do your best to make sure you're getting accurate information.
You know what? I actually did have one more question, if you don't mind. I know we're
Sure.
like already in an hour.
That's okay.
Um, I it wasn't on my list, and I'm just in my head was like, I want to ask this question. I hate that I have to ask this question. Quite honestly, I'm so perturbed by what has been happening this year. Neither here nor there. You guys are, I saw, you're on Susan Thixton's list, which is something I always recommend people check out, if for no other reason, to see what criteria she's looking for so that you as a pet parent are also starting to understand the criteria that you want to be looking for in a pet food, but that it is all human grade. And I think that in itself it's not always something that I am like steadfast 100% that it has to be, but when it comes to HPAI, I think that's a pretty good standard to have
Yeah,
with because you
absolutely.
do have poultry recipes and chicken specifically, and they are raw for cats. So I don't know if I remember Small Batch put out a statement just like everybody else,
Yeah, yeah,
with what you guys are doing.
absolutely. It's important to state first, it's a fluid situation. I don't know that anyone has a crystal ball for what the most ideal path forward is, but as of today, being closely connected with each of our suppliers, we talked about that earlier. Our direct contract makes a lot of the communication with the places that our raw materials are coming from a whole lot easier for us. Exclusively human grade or prepared for human meat channels or consumption is the next most important thing, because the practices that are implemented at that supplier level is absolutely the most critical layer of what we have to lean on right now. So their regular implementation of FDA recognized testing procedures is crucial. What we are looking at next, though, is as more testing potentially becomes available, anything that is accessible for testing a finished product, commercially prepared pet food, will be what we've got in our sights. As of right now, that doesn't exist. So doing the test and hold procedures for the pathogens that we do regularly test for is what we've got to focus on. We do have the freeze dried options for cats. That is actually an alteration process, and the temperature that is involved in freeze drying mitigates pathogens. So for people that maybe want a guarantee safer choice, freeze dried meal bites for cats is a great way to do that. And then we will also be talking about it a little bit at Global, but we have had a cooked recipe for cats in the works as kind of a background R&D project for several years now.
Wow.
So, not actually in response to this at all, but because we want small batch caliber materials in a format that people may find a little bit more, reassurance in, that has been focused. It actually, at the end of last year, sort of came back to the forefront as one of the next things that we wanted to get to market. But we will be having a perfectly cooked cat fighter available in the marketplace, hopefully by late summer of this year. So,
That's awesome.
we're kind of coming at it from a few different directions, but that real regular stringent communication with suppliers is absolutely ground zero.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. So again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you
Yeah,
so much for what you guys are doing in the industry and for pets. And I just appreciate you guys and hope to see you later on this year. So thank you
yeah,
again for being
sounds
here,
good.
Nicole.
Thank you for all of your messaging and advocacy too, because it's channels like this that we get to have, the detail in those discussions that is hard to translate in a lot of other formats. So we appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and all your listeners.
Well, guys, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thanks to Nicole, and give your pets some extra love from both me and Nicole today. And I will talk to you next week.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Bye.